Hello, readers. Louise Willder has been a copywriter for Penguin Books for 25 years, during which she has produced around 5,000 blurbs. And she's sharing that expertise as well as her love for books and writing in the new book, Blurb Your Enthusiasm, an A to Z of Literary Persuasion. Louise, thank you for the time. How you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So because there are a couple of different definitions for the word blurb, and I'll be honest, when I first heard about your book, I was thinking of the other definition. What are you speaking of when you talk about the fact that you have written around 5,000 blurbs during the course of your 25-year career as a copywriter at Penguin?
Yeah, this is a really contentious point, isn't it? The word blurb, I guess, because in the US with you, it means a review or an endorsement from an author, from another author that's usually given for an author's work in advance, and that's the common use of it. Whereas in the UK here, we more likely use it to mean a piece of descriptive copy about a book that appears on the book. So they have different meanings, but they come, I mean, the word initially, it was invented by an American author, as you might have read in the book. He wrote a comic book, a funny book called Are You a Bromide? And an advert for this book, there's an image of a woman and it says Miss Belinda Blurb and the Art of Blurbing, and it's such a really silly sort of lampoon of literary hype, and it talks about how this book is going to make you want to crawl through jungle and bite someone on the neck, and it's utterly ridiculous. And so I think ever since then we probably associate the word blurb, whether we use it in the American or the British sense, to mean a bit of hype, that's maybe a bit over the top. We might not necessarily believe it.
And what you hope is a decent summary of what somebody can expect within the pages. So think about if you're at a bookstore, you look at the jacket. Hopefully it's just the front part of the jacket, as we'll get to in a little bit, or maybe the back half. But it is that summary that you read that gives you an idea of what exactly it is that the book is about. It may help you out with a genre or just the overall tone of the book as well.
Absolutely, yes, it's so true. And I think hopefully you'll agree. I think it's more than just a summary or synopsis as well. It ideally, if it's well written, it should be like, a little miniature story as well in itself. A lot of writers have compared, writing a blurb to something like a sonnet or a detective novel, in the sense that it has a form that you follow and a very sort of tight structure. And so I think ideally, it should be something that's entertaining and intriguing in its own right. So it compresses the story, but it also invites the reader in.
Yeah, you do get a ton of creative license. And I'm going to be honest, as somebody who reads a lot of books for this podcast, I am jealous of the job that you get to do. You get to read books and you get to think of ways to creatively help pitch those books to prospective readers. How did you get into the business of blurbing to begin with, Louise?
Oh yeah, it is a great job. I know. I feel bad saying this. It's brilliant. I guess I've done it since the last century, so you would hope that I would enjoy it. Yeah, I started in publishing, so it's actually 26 years ago now, which seems crazy. So half my lifetime ago, and I initially started working in the publicity department, so PR, sending out press releases and things, which I don't think I was very well suited to, but I loved writing press releases and thinking, what's really going to hook a journalist into this book? How can I sum it up? And so it all came from that. And then I was lucky enough to get a job in this department that was solely dedicated to writing blurbs, which was just such an amazing time. Sort of like, pinch yourself. You can't believe you're doing this for a living. And now things have changed slightly, and I work within a marketing team. But the aim is the same. It's to invite a reader into a book and encourage them to read it, which is brilliant.
So I guess the process has probably changed for you over time. As you get better at something, you figure out ways to become more efficient at it. So what does that process currently look like for you? I mean, is it a matter of literally reading every page of the book that you're planning on blurbing? How much time do you have to read the book? And then how much time do you have to come up with that blurb afterwards? Because if I'm doing the math correctly, you've been writing about 200 blurbs a year going back 25, 26 years.
Yeah. It's a lot. You do, yeah, I do feel a bit like a blurb machine sometimes. I'm just churning them out. But I do try and read as much of the book as I can. It completely varies, you know, if it's a weighty non-fiction tome of about 800 words, I confess I will not read the whole thing. I'll read the introduction, I'll have a flick through, I'll look at the index. I'm like Harry Burns in When Harry Met Sally, and that I will always read the ending of every single book. I try not to do it in my own personal reading, but it's quite a hard habit to break. But with fiction, I do try and read the whole thing if I possibly can. You know, I might not if it's a very, very well-known classic that I've read before, or, you know, everyone knows the story to. But, you know, usually I will try and read it because I just want to know what happens at the end, and I'm not going to give away the ending, but I want to know where the story is going to go. And I need to, if I, you know, if I think if you're creating a mood around a story, you have to know where it ultimately ends up. So I will read, I will take tons of notes, I will try and get a sense of the writer's voice, because I think what people want to hear is the writer's voice and not my voice. And I'll pick out details, facts, because I think those are so much more interesting than adjectives, as I'm sure we'll go on to discuss.
Oh, yeah.
And then I will sort of, having done all that, I will try and then pretend that I haven't read the book, if that makes sense. It's kind of, you know, stepping outside a bit, I suppose, and then trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who will know absolutely nothing about it, which I suppose, you know, it's a similar technique to journalism, isn't it? I think, you know, when you're trying to tell someone about something and they might know absolutely nothing, so you have to get your message across clearly as well. So there are definitely certain techniques that you have, you know, start with a good hook, try and make an emotional connection, try and tell a story that's got drama and tension within it, and, you know, end with a bang or a mystery.
Well, it's interesting. You just mentioned adjectives, and I hadn't thought about this before, but a lot of authors are apparently opposed to adjectives, even though everybody uses adjectives. We have to. It's one of the three
Mm.
major bits of speech that we have to go along with verbs and nouns, of course. Where do you fall on adjectives, and just how liberally or conservatively do you use them when you're coming up with a blurb?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, that some people, some writers really hate adjectives with a passion, which I didn't quite realize either. You know, uh, there are tons of them. There's Elmore Leonard, who said, you know, if something looks like writing, then, you know, I rewrite it. And lots of other writers who just really don't like them at all. I think Hemingway, Mark Twain. I think Twain said, when you catch an adjective, then kill it. It's like, you know, they provoke quite violent reactions in people. And I can sort of understand why, because it's that rule of writing, which, you know, the familiar rule, which is show, don't tell. So I suppose rather than trying to describe a, you know, a character, in a novel as, you know, sinister or something like that, or to describe a book as groundbreaking, I suppose, I try and think, well, why is that the case? Why is that person sinister? Why is this book so amazing? And try and get to something concrete, if that makes sense. I think, you know, it can be so much more powerful. I think, like James Baldwin said, you know, he talked about having a sentence as clean as a bone. And, you know, I understand that, you know, this desire to remove extra stuff that feels unnecessary, rather than having some kind of hazy abstraction that you end up with something concrete. I've lots of examples in my book, but there's Hilary Mantel's books about the Tudors, which were really successful over here, and one of them is called Bring Up the Bodies, and there's a description I like on it. It says this novel is a speaking picture, and I think that's a good description. It doesn't just say, oh, it's vivid or it's colorful. It's something that sticks in your mind. It's George Orwell talked about using pictures and sensations when you write, which I love as an idea, because I think it stops you being lazy. You think, well, you know, you have to sort of, I think rather than telling somebody why something is great, you show them, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. Honestly, it really clicked for me after reading through this concept that
Right.
adjectives allow you to not have to think about something in metaphorical terms. And when at
Mm.
least I think about whether something ends up resonating a lot, oftentimes there is some sort of comparative illustration being made by the text. And when you're just saying
Mhm.
something is awesome or rad or great or horrible, it allows you to avoid really coming up with a great comparison that will sink in with the viewer or reader that much more.
So true.
So many authors also don't like subtitles, but I got to be honest, as somebody who reads a lot of nonfiction, Louise, I enjoy a good subtitle. Oftentimes, the subtitle can give you a better indication of what that book is about than the title itself. So, where do you fall on subtitles, and what makes for a good one?
Yeah, I understand your love of subtitles, and I'm definitely not a hater. As you know, there are many haters out there, aren't there, when it comes to all sorts of things. But I think they can be incredibly useful. I think one writer described them as a bit of a wallflower at a party, in the sense that they're not as glamorous as the title, or maybe a snazzy strapline that you'd see on the front of a book. They're quite functional, and often they get forgotten after a book is published. They tend not to become famous. Another writer compared them to like your middle name. So in a sense, it's not something that you shout about. But they can be so useful, especially when you have there's quite a trend for fairly mysterious titles sometimes. The subtitle needs to do a lot of heavy lifting with non-fiction. And I think if they're done really well, that they can also enhance a title. There's obviously the Michael Moore's book Stupid White Men, which was a huge hit. It was probably getting for 20 years ago now, aren't we? It had and other sorry excuses for the state of the nation
Hmm.
as its subtitle, which I thought was, it's kind of like a jab following up on the punch of the title. It's just a really nice addition to it. Um, and I think if a subtitle is done well, it can really add something to a book and create a mood as well, and appeal to a certain kind of audience. There's a book that did very well here a few years ago called Quiet. It was a self-help book, and the subtitle was I think it was The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, which I just think is very clever because it flatters a kind of certain bookish reader, and makes them feel special. So yeah, that these words can work really hard and hopefully entice us into the world of a book.
And I guess it also does make sense that a subtitle is typically more of a tool with nonfiction than fiction. Like a lot of
Mm.
times with a novel, it'll have the title and then it'll just say a novel. Or
Yes,
occasionally you get that with a memoir as well. So maybe the subtitle isn't quite as necessary with works of fiction.
I think so. Yeah, I think I don't know about you. I find it odd sometimes when things say a novel on the front. I mean, maybe it's just because the title is so outlandish and odd that people just need to be reassured. I assume that's the case. But I often feel it's not hugely necessary. And I think with yeah, there was a fashion, you know, centuries ago now, that uh, fiction novels would often have subtitles. So you had Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Hardy. It was a pure woman. Obviously, he was making a point there with his subtitle. And Vanity Fair, a novel without a hero. Again, it's a wry kind of statement, isn't it, that the author is making. And Animal Farm was a fairy story. Again, it's a nice little bit of irony a lot of the time with those subtitles. Maybe we should start doing it again.
Very true. I think it'd be interesting to see that trend reverse itself. Now,
Yeah.
I guess we're talking a lot about what authors don't like today. Authors seem to be very crusty people. They don't like a whole lot of people's writing
They
on
don't.
their own. They don't like adjectives. They don't like subtitles. And they also, a fair number of authors, actually don't like blurbs either. One of the most famous examples, of course, is J.D. Salinger, who refused subtitles on Catcher in the Rye for the longest time. Now, I'm sure since he has been
Mm.
deceased, we do get we do get blurbs rather occasionally with Catcher in the Rye, but why are so many authors opposed to blurbs?
Yeah, it's so funny, isn't it? I think it's actually in Salinger's contract, that you can't have any copy on his books at all. I mean, obviously now in the digital age, you have far more freedom to describe his books and sell them in other ways, but on the books themselves, nothing, you know.
Oh,
Title,
even
author name.
still, now that he's deceased,
Yeah,
subtitle or
yeah,
blurbs are
yeah.
not allowed on his books. Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, I think that's still the case. I'm sure a friend of mine recently worked on some. Maybe I actually will double check that, but as far as I know, this is still the case now, which is really strange. And I guess, you know, it's a suspicion of hype, isn't it? It's an author wanting to control their work and be protective of it, I suppose. You know, in a sense, I do understand that, because, you know, your words are very precious to you, and it's the idea that someone's going to interpret them wrongly. There's another, I mean, in the UK, it's quite a famous example of the author Jeanette Winterson, whose books were rejacketed by her publisher, and they were given new blurbs as well, which she hated so much that she publicly burned her own books on social media, like set fire to them in a bonfire to make her point. I mean, I assume that you know, she might have seen these before this occasion, but you know, she just wanted to express her annoyance that, you know, she said they'd made her novels, which, you know, are novels of ideas. She said they'd made them cozy and domestic. And I'm not necessarily sure I agree, because I think, you know, her publishers wanted to appeal to a wide market, which is perfectly fair. And works can be interpreted in absolutely any way. So to a reader who doesn't know anything about her books, they probably want to know what happens as well. They want to know the story. But I do understand this tension between what's inside a book and the way it's presented. You know, authors throughout history have understandably been very worried about the words that describe their books on their books. So George Orwell as well worried a great deal about the way his books were described, and he had a lot of say over them, you know, quite rightly.
Yeah, that's understandable. But by the same token, you do provide examples from your own career of authors that are very pleasant to work with regards to blurbs. They may offer some notes here and there, but ultimately they trust you to do a good job with that. It does beg the question, though, do authors ever write their own blurbs?
They absolutely do at certain publishers. I think it completely varies. There are some publishers, like the one that I work at, where they employ copywriters specifically to do this. Sometimes an editor will do it. Sometimes an author will. The author Terry Pratchett actually advised that most writers should start writing their own blurbs even before they finish their novels, because it can really help you think about structure and where a story is going to go. But, you know, other authors, I think mostly it's a collaborative process. You know, anything that I write will always be approved by an author, absolutely. And I will always try and incorporate any changes that they want, unless they try and add hundreds and hundreds of words to something, which, you know, a few do. And one author said to me, you know, this blurb is so comprehensive now, nobody's going to have to read the book. And bless him, you know, I think that's not really the aim. But, you know, we managed to reach a compromise, and you know, a lot of authors, I think, especially if they, you know, if they're journalists as well or something like that, they understand the need to, you know, really boil something down to its essence.
Did you write the blurb for Blurb Your Enthusiasm?
Well, sort of is the answer. Yeah, I think it was a bit of a process, because initially, I mean, as with a lot of copy, it depends on the actual format and the space you've got to work with. So I think initially we thought it was going to have, you know, a traditional kind of dust jacket. So I actually got 6 copywriter friends to each write a blurb for me, which was really nice of them. Just sort of partly for that reason, and as an experiment as well. And they were all completely different. It was brilliant. And in the end, I can actually show you the final book. There's actually a tiny amount of space. So, you know, there was this much space, and then the rest of it is lovely review quotes, or blurbs, as you would say in the US. And so we couldn't use those because they were just all a bit long. So I put them at the back as an appendix, because I just thought it was fun to see, you know, how different people interpret a work. And I also added a blurb a computer generated blurb by an online blurb generator, which is just crazy, really. And so in the end, it was predictably a bit of a collaboration between my editor and me. And I do say in the book that I think ideally authors probably shouldn't write their own blurbs because they're a bit too close to the book. And I do understand this now, having written a book. I think it's really hard to judge your own book in a way that you do other people's, and to try and kind of see the wood for the trees, I guess. But yeah, I broke my own rule, I'm afraid.
Well, look, that is your job by day, so I certainly understand an exception being made for you. But yeah, I get the whole being a little bit too close to things. I mean, you've just asked somebody to write tens of thousands of words, and then you want them to summarize everything they've just hopefully poured their heart and soul into on those pages in 1 to 200 words.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost cruel, isn't it, to make them do that, I think.
You did explore some of the all-time great authors and just their thoughts on blurbs and also how they marketed themselves. And interestingly, Charles Dickens was way ahead of his time as a marketer of his own books. How so?
Yeah, I'm a big Dickens fan. I just think he's wonderful. And I think, a lot of people are still a bit snobbish about him sometimes because he was so popular and because he was so good at promoting himself. He was incredibly ahead of his time in this way. There are several things he did. I think he created a sense of mystery about himself. Initially, he had this pen name Boz, and nobody knew who Boz was. He really built up the suspense around that. And at the time, his novels were serialized on a monthly basis. And he wasn't the first to do this, but he really made it his own. He deliberately created suspense in the novels, and sometimes he would actually respond to what readers liked and wanted. He would add new characters, or he would change things in response to what readers wanted. So I think he was a real master of marketing in that sense. And I also think that we think of today as like, oh no, it's so commercial, there are so many adverts around today, we're bombarded with information. Whereas if you look at the Victorian era, it was exactly the same. There were adverts everywhere. There were adverts on books, there were adverts in books. So I think just as if you're watching TV today, you're used to having your experience kind of broken up by ads. I think the Victorian reader was just the same. So in the Pickwick Papers by Dickens, there are ads for for pills that are going to help your liver and things that are going to help your corns and your bunions on your feet. And it's just tons of this commercial material. So I think, it was a commercial age and he really embraced it. And, he was a real showman. He loved giving public readings of his books. I think he would put any author to shame today. He was absolutely tireless, and he gave these incredibly dramatic readings. He would often kind of faint afterwards because he was so exhausted from it all. So, I think, yeah, he was really the ultimate self-promoter.
You mentioned author tours, and that's obviously something that went away during the COVID era. And thankfully, it's starting to come back a little bit. I'm starting to become a little bit concerned, though, Louise, that a lot of these bookstores, because it does save them money, obviously, are choosing to go the Zoom route with the author tour and hold something virtually versus doing it in person in the bookstore. Then again, I'm a sucker for the physical copy of a book. I don't know about you, but I will read books on an e-reader from time to time, just out of necessity. But if I can help it, I'm getting the physical copy. And there's also something about just going to a bookstore and browsing through all of the wonderful reads there too.
Oh, I completely agree. Yes, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, obviously Zoom is great because we can do things like this,
Right.
we can cross the Atlantic Ocean. But but yeah, I completely agree that in person is so great. It's such a thrill to go and see an author that you love. And it's such a thrill to hold a book in your hands, isn't it? You think, I don't think that ever goes away. And I think, yes, it was so sad during lockdown that bookshops just couldn't really do their jobs. So I'm so glad that's all finished. And that, actually, talking of that, there was one thing I write about in my book, which is that when bookshops did start gradually reopening after the first lockdown we had in the UK, and I think this happened in the States as well. Someone told me that a lot of bookshops displayed books with their back covers out so that people could read the blurbs or the synopsis on the back, so rather than looking at the front, which, you know, obviously felt like a moment of vindication for blurb writers.
Yeah, you know, that's a very funny point there for you. And also it's a nice courtesy by those bookshops. Now, have you gotten to do any in-person events since the release of Blurb Your Enthusiasm?
You know, I'm actually quite new to all of this. So I've done a lot of lovely Zoom interviews like this with people in the States. I've done a few UK interviews as well. But I'm actually doing my first in-person event the weekend after next at a literary festival in Wiltshire in England. So yeah, that's, fingers crossed it will be okay. I think I'm excited about it, but it's a whole new world from, you know, being behind the scenes in publishing to being out there in the spotlight. It's exciting and scary at the same time.
Yeah, I bet. So you've done more US interviews than you have UK interviews so far?
I think it's been about half and half.
Yep.
My book is actually, it's available in the US from the 11th of October, I believe, is the pub date with you. So I think, you know, that the podcasts seem to be really popular in the States. I think possibly more than they are here. So it's been a bit more traditional newspapers and things in the UK and lots of podcasts in the US, which is great. It's such an opportunity.
Well, I do wonder also, because the title is such a good one, if it has to do with the fact that Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is obviously the play on words that you use for the title, is much more popular here in the US and not as well known in the UK, or do people know
Yeah.
about Larry David and all his insane antics over there too?
I mean, I love it, and I know a lot of people who love it in the
Okay.
UK as well.
Okay, good.
I think actually it's the kind of humor that travels really well
Oh yeah.
and people really appreciate here. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's pretty, it's the humor of awkwardness, isn't it? You know, so being British, we love that because we're so uncomfortable in our own skins as a nation, you know. I think a lot of us really like it.
Yeah, who doesn't love the asshole who can't help himself but gets into confrontations in public and in private, right?
So true.
So we just talked about Dickens, who has obviously written a number of classics. You've blurbed, or is it reblurbed, a lot of classics. But what makes a book a classic, Louise?
Um, oh yeah, I mean, there are loads of definitions of this. There are, you know, there are some quite funny ones. One writer said a classic's sort of something you always say that you're rereading rather than reading. You know, there's a lot of kind of cultural cachet attached to these things. And I give a definition, which is that it's often something you were forced to read against your will while you were at school. And then hopefully, you know, in a lot of the times in my experience, you either realize at the time or perhaps a few years later when you reread it that it is actually great and there is a reason it's a classic. You know, something like Jane Eyre, I remember being so against when I was young. I was like, I don't want to read about this fusty house and this attic. I mean, it just sounds terrible. And then when I did sit down and read it, I was just absolutely enthralled. There's something about you know, that first person narrator that just grabs you and won't let you go. So yeah, you know, hopefully reading it, you know, a classic is ultimately a happy experience rather than one you associate with, you know, school.
Now, blurbs tend to be third person. You just mentioned the first person narrative. Do first and second person perspectives ever come into play when you're writing blurbs? And if so, what are the instances there?
Mm. Um, I think, yeah, I talk about this the second person quite a bit because I think it's interesting using the word you. It's a word that I think is often used in advertising. You know, there's a famous recruitment campaign from the First World War, but you know, your country needs you, and I think, yeah,
I want you.
exactly. Yeah, of course, you know, in the States you've got that. And but I think, you know, it's something that can, obviously it's very forceful, but you can also make people feel a bit hectored and like, you know, leave me alone. But I do think one of the things I say is that I think if the word you could be replaced by we or everyone, then I think it really works. And there are a few blurbs where I think it's used really cleverly. There's one, there's a book here by a Black British writer. It's called British, and it's about, the experience of colonialism in this country. And it starts with saying, you're British, your parents are British. It goes on and it's like, so why do people keep asking you where you're from? Which I think is something so universal to a lot of people from ethnic minorities in this country. And so I think if you can somehow universalize that word you, if that makes sense, then I think it can be really effective.
So you don't have a ton of pet peeves that you mentioned in this book. One is blurbs that tend to go on for way too long. We touched on that a
Yeah.
little bit earlier with authors attempting to write their own blurbs or rewrite blurbs, as it were. But one of your big pet peeves is something that I alluded to at the start of this conversation, and that has to do with a blurb that takes up the front and back flaps of a book jacket. What is it that you dislike so much about blurbs that are comprised of both?
Yeah. So now I'm being a hater, aren't I? It's like, I hate that.
You know what though? I get it though, because even ever before reading your ideas on things, I found myself annoyed by the fact, like, do I really need to flip to the back now to continue this thing? Can't we
Yeah,
do it a
yeah.
little bit quicker?
It's like, just like, why make the reader, the poor reader, who might be standing up in a bookshop looking at tons of stuff, why are you making them do this extra work? And I don't believe that anyone is going to read all that to the end when they're standing in a bookshop. And I think it's really odd. It's like this idea that you have to fill up this, that some authors, editors, I think, feel that you have to fill every inch of space that's available. And I don't know if it's, because they want to be taken seriously, they want to show that their book is very weighty and important, or they want to kind of fill the space with the kind of sentences that they hope a book reviewer will kind of replicate in some way, saying how provocative or groundbreaking or amazing it is. So yeah, I think I sort of know why it's done, but I don't think it's fair on the reader and their poor eyes. It's like, I think when I read that when you read in an F shape, you don't actually read everything, so your eyes are kind of going all over the place. And the idea that someone's going to read every single word of this, I just think is a fantasy.
Oh wow, F shape. I'm definitely guilty of that at times. I'm also guilty of the E shape sometimes too, though, where you read the very
Ah,
beginning and you read the
right.
very end pretty closely, and you just kind of skim through the
Yeah,
middle. But we all have those different strategies. Now, like
yeah.
you, I love the comedy of the late great Bill Hicks, fellow Texan, fellow native Texan like I am. You even won me over when you quoted him at the start of a chapter. So it should be no surprise to anybody that both of us are fans of well-placed cuss words. When, if at all, is it appropriate to cuss in a blurb?
Yeah, I love the word cuss. It's such a great word. So I just wanted to say, and yeah, sadly we don't really say that word very much here, which is a shame. I guess we say swearing, which is just not as fun, is it, as cussing? Yeah,
Sure.
I think it's, as with so many things, that different literary effects that I talk about, like puns or different types of punctuation. It's when you use it and using it sparingly and using it wisely. I have absolutely nothing against swearing, cussing in principle, and there's a lot of research that shows that if you use a great variety of rude words, then you have a richer vocabulary overall. And Steven Pinker, the psychologist, talks about the things that happen in our brains when we read a swear word, like the really kind of ancient parts of our brains are activated. We might even display physical symptoms like getting a bit sweaty when we see a swear word, because they've got this real emotional charge. They do get our attention, but also for that reason, obviously, some people don't like them. So you have to think of your audience. And I think if you can use them in a funny way, like there's a book, The Life-Changing Magic of Not Giving a F. I don't know if I can
Fuck.
swear on this, so I'm not going
You
to.
can say fuck.
But um, but it's funny. It makes you laugh. There's a contrast, but the going on in that that book title. So so I think it's fun. And obviously on Amazon, you can't even have the swear word anyway, so you have to use the asterisk, which again I think can also be quite playful. The American writer Mary Norris, who is also a copy editor, she talks about the asterisks as like little fireworks going off within a word, which I just think is such a lovely description, because there is something quite playful about it. So yeah, I think probably the whole point of my book is that language should be fun. So, you know, this is part of it.
That's another one of those great metaphors, I guess. And boy, speaking of jobs that I'm jealous of you getting to write blurbs for a living. I am jealous of the individual who gets to study the positive powers of cuss words for a living. And they've also done the research to find that saying a cuss word when you're in pain can have a sort of anti-pain effect. So for my 6 and 8-year-old, this is father of the year stuff here, I know. For my 6 and 8-year-old, we try and teach them the value of words having meaning in terms of the tone, in terms of how you use them, in terms of the audience as well. There are certain situations where it is okay for them to cuss in front of us and they won't get into a lick of trouble. Now, if they're cussing at us, that's a completely different story. But if one of them, you know, bangs their shin or jams their finger on something, if they let an F word fly, I'm probably going to laugh at it and not get any upset in any way, shape, or form.
Wow, you are a cool parent.
Well, I'm either a cool parent or I'm one that's really going to mess them up as adults.
No.
So we both love cussing, Louise, and we both love the ellipsis, that dot, dot, dot that allows for a bit of a pause or maybe a bit of a cliffhanger effect on the text that you're writing. Once again, just like with adjectives, I was surprised to learn that there are apparently a bunch of ellipsis haters out there. What the hell?
There are, aren't there? They're so grumpy, these writers. Yeah, I think, oh, the ellipses, they really rile the language pedants, don't they? That's like their bête noire. I think they think, you know, they belong to hacks, they're commercial, they're formulaic, you know, they're kind of lazy, but I don't know. I just think there are some aspects of language that are just beyond our control. I don't know if you agree. Like, I think if you add an ellipsis to the end of a sentence, it does make it more mysterious. There's, you know, that there's nothing you can do about it. You know, I think despite ourselves, you know, we do get some kind of sense of mystery from it. And so, you know, you see them all over the place on thrillers. And I think that's absolutely fine. You know, it's perhaps not necessary, but there's one writer who just said, you know, so what? You know, the things that aren't necessary make life interesting. So, you know, as a little bit of fun, as a little bit of embellishment, yeah, I'm all for the ellipsis.
Well, look, as much as you and I both love text can be difficult because it is so devoid of tone. Now, obviously, you have periods, exclamation points, and question marks that can help out with that, but there aren't a whole lot of other tools you can lean on in that regard. And the ellipsis can really help with that. And I would also argue that it's got a bit of a duct tape quality too. It can be used in lieu of other symbols or punctuation marks that, let's be honest, nobody really knows when and how to properly use semicolons, dashes, hyphens, all these other things. Ellipses can fill in for those sorts of things from time to time as well.
It's so true, isn't it? And I mean, obviously, you know, as well, when you're part of what I do, I guess, is to pull out review quotes, you know, a quote from a newspaper or an article, and to kind of try and splice those together. So, you know, an ellipsis is so useful in that respect as well. Yeah, and as you say, I think with, you know, when you get into dashes, you know, parentheses, semicolons, nobody knows how to use those properly, do they? Or there are so many schools of thought that, you know, you're always going to trip yourself up. So yeah, the ellipsis is my friend, as is the question mark.
Yeah, question marks can be great too. Now I'm going to channel my inner Bill Hicks to state this next question as bluntly as possible. How do you blurb a book that sucks, Louise?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I suppose I need to try and be magnanimous and to say that, you know, I feel, you know, like people, hopefully no book totally sucks. You know, you need to try and find something to love in them, don't you? Maybe I'm being wildly optimistic here.
You've written 5,000 blurbs. I'm assuming at least like 50 to 100 of those have no redeemable value.
It could be true. I guess, you know, I mean, like, you know, every there's going to be someone out there who's going to enjoy this book, presumably somebody hopes. So the thing you're always doing is thinking of your audience. You know, I think, like, who is this book for? Who is this ideal reader? It might not be me. You know, it absolutely might not be me, but someone out there is going to love this book, I hope. And so I need to try and pick the things out that they will love. And, you know, if the story is completely meandering or all over the place or non-existent, then I need to try and pretend that there is a bit of a story, or try and boil something down to one writer called me a book's backbone. You know, I need to try and find that narrative and pinpoint it and create a structure. Yeah, even if even if the book doesn't quite live up to it.
Have you ever had to pass a book off, whether it just sucked so badly that you couldn't come up with something good, or maybe it's something that struck too close to home?
No, I honestly, like, you know, perhaps it's even an even greater challenge when it's it's something so terrible. Like, I have a friend at work, another copywriter, and we have a weekly meeting. Like, it's more just a chat and a gossip, really. And we sit down and you know, we'll often look at the copy that we've written that week, and one of us will go like, you know, nothing happens in this book, does it? And I'm like, oh God, yeah, you're right. Like, is it really obvious? It's like, yeah, try and make it less obvious. Try and, you know, end it with a question or an ellipsis.
So while I am the fan of occasional self-help books, I also recognize that a lot of them are just schleppy nonsense. So are there some general rules of thumb to writing blurbs for self-help books to keep them from sounding too schleppy for those blurbs where you're trying to help the reader maintain an interest in whatever they've picked up with to begin with?
Yeah, I think, well, again, I suppose it's like your previous question, you know, there's going to be someone out there that this book is for. And I think also, I don't think these books claim to be great literary works. When I asked one writer about it, she said, you know, it's like buying a self-help book. It's like paying for a plumber to fix my sink or my broken loo. You know, I want this to solve a problem for me. You know, I've got some issue that needs dealing with, and I want it to fix it. So I think, yeah, that I think one thing I noticed, that all the blurbs for self-help books, whatever they're about, you know, whether about how to get fit, how to deal with pregnancy, how to deal with stress in your life, even the self-help books that kind of mock the self-help genre in some way, they all follow the same pattern, which is they start with a problem, then they offer a solution, and then they kind of widen out to make a big promise to the reader. And I think it's the same pattern across absolutely everything.
Hmm.
I defy anyone to find a self-help book that does not follow this pattern.
No, they definitely do. I'm curious also, have you ever read a self-help book for the sake of the job and found it actually helping you out in the process?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I think I think some are actually great. There's a psychologist in the UK. She's very popular, called Philippa Perry. She's married to the artist Grayson Perry, and her book, which I've actually got on my shelf somewhere here in this messy room, it's called The Book You Wish Your Parents Had Read.
Hmm.
And you will be glad, and your children will be glad that you did, which I just think is a great title. And I found this book brilliant, even though it wasn't necessarily designed for me. I don't have kids, but my sister, who does, said, you know, you have to read this book. You're going to understand everything about our childhood when you do. And so I think, yeah, these types of books can surprise you. You know, we're all human. We're all flawed creatures. We all have problems. We all have our stuff that needs dealing with.
The Bible is the most consumed book of all time. Have you ever blurbed the Bible? And if not, how would you do so?
I love the fact that we've moved from self-help to the Bible. This is brilliant. um, um, I have not written a blurb for the Bible, but a colleague of mine has, and I think if I were to write one, I think, I hope it's not blasphemous to say this, I would just treat it as any other book. I would think, who wants to read this? Who is the audience for this? What's actually in this? Which version is this? You know, what do they need to know about it? What do they need to know about its history and context, and what's actually in it? Is this a new version? Is this a new translation? I feel like, you know, it's probably a book you don't really need to make a big claim for, but so you can be quite functional, and sometimes that's fine, you know, just tell people what's inside. Yeah, I would not be scared of blurbing the Bible.
Love that. And I think that's a great answer too. All right. So from self-help to the Bible to
Yeah.
erotica. Have you ever had to write a blurb for erotic fiction?
From the sacred to the profane. um, uh, I've spoken to a lot of people who've written copy for erotic fiction. Sadly, I don't get to do this. I work in a slightly more serious area of publishing, to my great annoyance. But I've got friends who've worked on it, and you know, some of them have said, you know, how the briefs for, you know, we get all sorts of crazy briefs as copywriters, you know, it's like, you know, but sort of like that, but not like that, you know, so all these things, and ones that, you know, it's obviously just a piece of erotic fiction, isn't it? You know, can you pitch this as a classic love story for all time, please? Like, oh yeah, sure, of course it is. And another friend of mine who got to work on a poster campaign for this really successful erotic novel, and he came up with the line in the end, "Come and get it." I was like, oh yeah, that's brilliant. Just get to the point.
No, sometimes those puns,
I know.
they hit right at the
It's
core of the
terrible.
issue. Terrible, but great at the same time.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
gotta consider the audience, and you gotta consider the product as well, I guess.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah.
last question, Louise. We've talked a little bit about the difference in the word blurb and what it means here in the US versus what it means in the UK, but the word blurb, that secondary meaning, I think is starting to resonate more with people here in the US. So what is the difference between blurbs where you are versus where I am here in the United States?
Mhm. Oh, that's interesting, that about the meaning of the word may be changing over there, which I wasn't aware of actually. Well, I guess we've covered, you know, the difference in the meaning of the word itself between the UK and the US. And I think, yeah, I devote a chapter just to looking at the difference between blurbs in the States and blurbs over here, because I just find it really fascinating how different our books look sometimes. You know, not only do they have different cover designs, but the way the covers are used, I just find really fascinating. I think that in the UK, often the back of a book it's a vehicle for design as well as words, whereas I think in the US, it's more of a vehicle for words. You know, that there's a lot of copy on US books. And I get the sense, you know, that it's trying to cover all bases, you know, trying to be completely comprehensive. There are often lots of adjectives, lots of adverbs, you know, it's very verbose. And who knows if this is down to cultural differences? You know, it's so easy to make these sweeping statements, isn't it? But so I spoke to a lot of Americans I know in publishing, and, you know, there were all sorts of explanations that, you know, it's just like American speech is, you know, far more hyperbolic. You know, there's a greater commitment to diversity possibly. So, you know, you want to have, you know, a review from, you know, the New York Times and the Dallas Morning News or whatever, you know, you just want to cover all your bases. There's the love of reading groups in the US. So perhaps, you know, there's just lots and lots of extra wordiness, I think, you know, on the book jackets, but also at the back, you have loads of reading group questions, you know, often some extra material. I mean, who knows really? I've got my own pet theory as well, that, you know, in some senses, I think America has greater reverence for its language than we do here, which might seem a slightly counterintuitive thing to say, but, you know, I think, you know, you're the land of the spelling bee and long form journalism. And so I think in some senses, you know, I think you have a real respect for the written word, possibly that we don't have so much over here. I think especially in England, you know, we're quite cynical and and you know, our journalism tends to be a lot shorter. You know, we possibly don't always treat our language with the respect it deserves. But, you know, I don't know, that could just be complete speculation.
Once again, maybe a little bit too close to the issue, because I kind of feel that way about the US from time to time, especially if I spend
Yeah.
more than 5 minutes on Twitter and just watch people, journalists included, just hurl ugliness at one another back and forth.
Well, oh, Twitter is just a bear pit, isn't it? No, I do understand that. Yeah, I think maybe it's the grass is always greener and we just always admire other people's cultures rather than our own.
Right. As my friend once put it, Twitter is pretty much the digital bathroom wall on the internet. She is
So
Louise
true.
Willder. The new book is Blurb Your Enthusiasm, an A to Z of Literary Persuasion. Louise, thank you so much for the time today. And thank you for a book that I think is as observant in the world of blurbing, the ins and outs of blurbing, as Larry David is walking around the city of Los Angeles.
What a great compliment. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. And thanks to you for hanging out. You can watch, listen, learn, and connect for free at booksonpod.com. For Books on Pod, I'm Trey Elling. Good day.